Good evening, everyone, and I'm delighted to welcome Paul Mason, furthest away from me, and Robert Skidelsky to the 25th anniversary Charleston Festival for one of the most eagerly anticipated events of this year, one of our most eagerly anticipated sessions, a contemporary evaluation of John Maynard Keynes, who frequently stayed at Charleston and subsequently lived a stroll across the field away in Tilton, together with his wife, the Russian ballerina Lydia Lopakova. As the journalist, the economic journalist Will Hutton remarked when he came to the festival several years ago, Charleston's association with Keynes means that we're all standing on hallowed ground. Paul Mason is one of the most prominent journalists now writing and broadcasting. He was one of the best guides to the financial crisis of 2008, shepherding us through the coils of the disaster in urgent bulletins on Newsnight. He then turned his attention to the Arab Spring, and he's written a book analysing global unrest, recently updated as Why It's Still Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolution. Paul is in the forefront of mainstream journalism's embrace of blogging and social media. Last year, he left his post as Economics Editor on BBC Two's Newsnight to join Channel 4, first as Culture and Digital Editor, and from this June as Economics Editor. Paul has also written a novel, Rare Earth, which fictionalises the sprawling, corrupt economy of China. Most importantly, as far as tonight is concerned, he's a great admirer of the work of Charleston's economist in residence in perpetuity, John Maynard Keynes. Robert Skidelsky is Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at Warwick University. His 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes won 5 prizes, and his book on the current crisis, Keynes, The Return of the Master, was published in 2010. He was a member of the House of Lords. He was made a member of the House of Lords in 1991, where he sits on the crossbenches, and elected a Fellow of the Royal Academy in 1994. How Much Is Enough? The Love of Money and the Case for the Good Life, co-written with his son Edward, was published in 2012. Now, Robert has an amazingly distinguished career, as you've heard, but his main claim to fame is that he spoke at the very first Charleston Festival 25 years ago. I can prove it. The 1990 festival celebrated Bloomsbury's links with Eastern Europe because the festival took place in May and the Berlin Wall had fallen the previous November. So the theme of the festival, which consisted of 9 events, was to celebrate Bloomsbury's link with Eastern Europe. And for interest's sake, the subject of Robert's talk, I don't know if you remember, Robert, was Keynes's Hogarth Press pamphlet, the Hogarth Press published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, entitled A Short View of Russia, published in 1925, which just goes to show how relevant Keynes still is today, with a need to understand Russia dominating the news again. So I'm delighted, first of all, to hand over to Paul Mason.
Thank you, Diana, and I'm always delighted. This is my second time here to speak at Charleston. It's just an amazing atmosphere, and when you get here, everything else, including the Dalek-like obsession of my profession all day with UKIP, pales. UKIP have got, it's like a sort of mantra. UKIP have caused a landslide, apparently. Anyway, I'm trying to sort of move us away from some of that to a longer term perspective. And Robert is going to talk to me later. That's why he's sitting here. So we'll have a discussion, and you, I think, will ask us some questions. Now, in 1930, while the world was still reeling from the Wall Street crash, Keynes he published a remarkable essay called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in it, he imagined a world where, as he put it, mankind's economic problem has been solved. By 2030, he said, barring unforeseen wars and given the population doesn't rise too fast, a combination of technological advance and rising wealth could mean that there was enough for everybody. And this would be quite a big change, he pointed out, because the entire history of humanity up to then had been determined by the fact that there was not enough for everybody. For the first time since his creation, Keynes wrote, and you can almost hear him, whenever you read out Keynes, you just have to hear him in that garden. For the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real, his permanent problem, how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, and to live wisely and agreeably and well. Scarcity had been the basic assumption of economics. As Leon Walras, the founder of marginalist economics, put it in his famous textbook, there are no products that can be multiplied without limit. All things which form part of social wealth exist only in limited quantities. Well, Walras's book is currently available in the unlimited quantity of one at googlebooks.com. Keynes' essay exists as a PDF on Yale University's website for free. The smartphone in your pocket, though not free, is, if it's an Android, and 70% of them will be, or using an operating system that is free. And those of you Googling, I know you were told not to use your mobiles, but if you're surreptitiously down there Googling Walras, then you're using a service that is free, albeit owned by a multi-billion-pound corporation, Google, which will lead you to a encyclopedia that is free, which is not owned by a multi-billion corporation, but owned by effectively a co-op, which makes all commercial encyclopedias impossible. The web server you'll be communicating on, if you're Googling, texting, or anything else, is probably running on software designed so that nobody can own it. Because of new technology, these old walls around us and these old paintings inside that house and this place is alive with information in a new way. And that, I think, is adding a new dimension to economics. And it casts Keynes' original prediction about abundance in a new light. It was the quite classical, quite mainstream, quite right-wing economist Paul Romer who in 1990 stated the earth-shakingly obvious that information goods are infinitely copyable. And if the normal laws that mainstream economics thinks exist almost like out there in the ether, if the normal laws of the market operated on information products, their price would rapidly decline towards the cost of producing them, which is zero or nearly zero. Once you've produced one, the next one is free. Even as we grapple with the aftermath of our own Wall Street crash and live through our own version of the 1930s, as Prince Charles has helpfully pointed out, we're facing a new problem. The rise of information goods whose abundance is probably, I think, the indirect cause of, and maybe the solution to, our current state of play, which is low growth, high inequality, and growing social unrest. So this is Keynes' country. Amid these lanes and the Saxon churches up on the downs, Keynes imagined and fought for a society and a way of life based on liberalism and aesthetics. The market would eventually provide for all and create a confident, socially adventurous leisure class. We know how socially adventurous they were, whose purpose was to understand and create beauty and to work as little as possible. This was the view Keynes grew up with in those rooms that are 20 yards away with Grant, Bell, Lytton Strachey, etc. That was their view of what the ideal society would be. Now, that view, by 1930, had been dented, first of all, by the First World War, shattered in many ways, but it would be really finished off by the Depression. So this grandchildren essay, which was originally a lecture at Cambridge in 1928, but he publishes in 1930, March 1930, in full knowledge that the Wall Street crash has happened. It does stand, I think, and in Robert's book, you contextualise what he was thinking about at the time. It stands as almost the last utterance of Keynes' pre-Depression view. In March 1930, he was still, in other words, confident that the world was going through a process of adjustment to something better, higher productivity. You know the 1920s were a great period of rollout of the Taylorist mass production methods of scientific management, of Fordism, of the production line, of Alfred Sloan's innovations in business processes in the car industry, in chemistry, in armaments. There was progress in the 20s to a great degree. Of course, radio is the other thing. And Keynes thought, well, look, this means, this crisis we're having here is just meaning that the economy is adjusting not fast enough. Interest rates are too sticky, they're not falling fast enough, employment patterns are not adjusting fast enough to automation and to rising productivity, he wrote. So as with all insights into the future, Keynes' essay is full of misunderstandings, I would argue, about the present then. In 1930, the great wave of bank insolvencies that would trigger the Depression was 12 months ahead. Hoover was in the White House. No developed country had yet left the gold standard. Argentina had and Brazil had, that was it. Ramsay MacDonald was still in Downing Street and he was still listening to J.M. Keynes. And the Nazis had 12 seats in the Reichstag out of 491. So, it's understandable. So that the underlying tone is, don't worry. These are the growing pains of a new economy based on technology, and with the help of governments, the market will sort it out. And that was wrong. But there is in the essay, which, as I say, if you want to read it rather than listen to me, you can download it now on your mobile. There is in the essay something breathtakingly far-sighted. At its heart is the proposition that one day capitalism will grow over into something else. That if that happens, it will be because of technology, that we'll have a major psychological problem if it does happen, adjusting our lifestyles to a situation where money is not important, that in fact love of money will come to be seen as a disease. Keynes writes this in a very funny but quite prophetic passage. And that economics will just become like a technique. It will become like dentistry, as interesting as dentistry, Keynes says. He looks into the future in this essay using 3 yardsticks: the rate of technical innovation, the rate of growth of the population, and the growth of capital through the magic of compound interest. And he estimated that productivity would safely grow at 1% a year, and that capital would grow by 2% a year, because that's what compound interest should be. It was significantly higher than that because of the tight money policies that he thought triggered the Depression. So it was safe to assume that if you get 1% productivity growth and 2% capital growth, that by 2030, in the advanced economies, the standard of living would be 4 to 8 times what it was in 1930. And if technology improved as he thought it would, 8 times would probably be an underestimation. So what happened? Well, I'm going to talk about the global economy later, but let's just take the UK for now, because we have got continuous figures for that. According to Angus Maddison's data, Maddison's project is a great boon to us, his economic historians, which measures the historic output in terms of 1990 US dollars since the year 1 AD. You can tell what spacious thinking Angus Maddison was up to. GDP per head in Britain in 1930, according to this, was $5,441. Now it takes until 1972 to double, and to, as Maddison says, $11,294 US dollars at 1990 prices. So it takes 42 years to double. Now, if we switch to modern data, and I'm using data from Trading Economics, which has the advantage that it's free, we can reset UK GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation, at $20,000 in 1973, and it doubles to $40,000 by 2008, the eve of the Lehman Brothers crash. And so now it's below that. It's 38K on this measure. It doesn't matter what the measure is, but basically it doubles from 72 to 2008, meaning that in 2008 we hit the 4 times, as Keynes imagined, 4 times 1930, and that leaves us below. And so to hit the target of 8 times living standards, you'll gather here that I'm being quite unscientific, but so was he in the essay. To hit the target, it has to regain its pre-Lehman Brothers point of 40k, and then it has to double in the next 15 years. And I don't think there are many economists in this room, such as you are, more expert than me, who think it will. The chances of it doubling in 15 years are low. Even if it grows as fast as it did in the Goldilocks economy years, 1992 to 2008, $1,000 a year, it'll take till 2054, and as you'll see, I think that there are chances there that are quite low. You'll be thinking, of course, but we feel so much better off in material terms. Some of you were alive in the 30s, maybe. So maybe some of you were alive in 1930. My mother was born in 35, so there's a good chance that there's people in this room who were alive then. Right. And you'll also be thinking, what about all the plastic toys in the actual bedrooms of our actual grandchildren? They look a bit sort of abundant. And what about all the iPads? And what about Mexico and China? Well, I'll come to all that in a minute. First, what got in the way of the 8 times progress that Keynes predicted? Quickly, the Depression. So the Depression lasts, say, 10 years, and then you get 5 years of war and destruction and rapid growth at the end of it. Keynes' caveat of no major wars was confounded, obviously, and the population did grow. There were 45 million people in Britain when he wrote it. There'll be 70 million by 2030. But I don't think these changes alone explain why the power of compound interest failed to deliver. If we take a very broad view of economic history, since the grandchildren essay, we could say that after the war you get 30 years of, the 30 glorious years, as the French call them, of high productivity, combined with relatively low real rates of return on capital. And that's because the inflation implicit in the global system Keynes created eventually, or not only eventually choked off the long boom, but at the very beginning did help suppress returns on financial capital. In a now famous academic paper, Reinhardt and Sprancher, two American economists, point out that financial repression, as we now call it, meant that interest rates were really negative for at least half of the long boom. So what that means is that Keynes, the magic of compound interest wasn't working, even if productivity was powering ahead as it was. Those of you who remember, anybody who worked in a factory in the 50s and 60s will know how brilliant productivity was at that time. But then, from about 92 till 2008, you do get high returns on capital, but you get suppressed productivity growth. GDP per capita rises relentlessly, but an ever greater part of social wealth is devoted now to state-provided incomes and services. And this creates a debt problem for states, soon compounded by a debt problem for consumers, which we know all too well about. So if you wanted to be really cruel to Keynes, he does stalk this venue, but you could really say what got in the way of his vision was Keynes. That first of all, an inflationary global system that he helped design, and then the weight of the social state in modern economies. Now, I'm not saying here there shouldn't be a social state, nor even that it should be smaller or that it shouldn't exist. Simply pointing out that in the year he wrote the essay, 30% of GDP max was going on state spending, and it's 45%-ish now. We have to recognise that another of Keynes' assumptions didn't hold, and that was that rising wealth brings rising equality. As Thomas Piketty, the now almost rock star, godlike, envy of all the rest of us, with his #1 Amazon book that you can't even find in a bookshop in America because they ordered too few. Thomas Piketty has pointed out that the mid-20th century was a period of flattened inequality. It was logical to assume, in Keynes' generation, that development and innovation and education would go on flattening out inequality, but it hasn't. In the late 70s, the ruling elites of the West decided capitalism couldn't really coexist with organised labour, and they began a project, first in Japan, then here, and the USA, and finally Germany in the 2000s, to strategically weaken labour's bargaining power. And the result is, as Piketty argues, and I agree, rising inequality within developed societies. Every recovery brings a new rise in asset, wealth and income for the rich, but not the poor, and the middle class in Anglo-Saxon countries is hollowed out. Now, under these conditions, even rising GDP can lead to the increasing poverty among large parts of the population, and you just get the oligarch's yacht alongside the food bank forever. if you're not careful. So on this basis, I don't think the future looks very bright. I think demographics is the extra thing we have to throw into Keynes's. Keynes wasn't thinking, how will the age profile of the population change? Maybe, but we now know how it has changed. Many of us in this room are part of that bulge that now sits atop the great Christmas tree of demographic graphs showing doom. Because S&P believe, the ratings agency, that 60% of all states will go bust in 2050, even with the austerity that they've implemented to deal with the fiscal crisis because of ageing. But, and here's my point, inequality and low growth, alongside high returns on financial capital and challenging demographics, I don't think are the fundamental problem. If they were, there'd be a solution, albeit one, and it's quite Keynesian, but it would seem too radical for the political centre now. New global rules-based currency system that makes the mercantilist strategies of Germany, Japan and China, which are export-orientated, dumping, in other words, unemployment on the rest, impossible. So an agreed rebalancing of the world, one. Two, a new repression of financial profit, a new euthanasia of, as Keynes put it, never one to shy away from great metaphors, of the rentier class. Do it however you want, but you just have to do it. You have to suppress financial profit, a new swing of distribution towards labour and away from capital, and a new spurt of technological innovation that creates demand faster than the old wants are satisfied. That is the implication of Piketty's book, and if social democracy and British Labour ever stops floundering around in the ruins of the old system, that would be what they would do. But I would argue it doesn't address the fundamental problem or the opportunity. The fundamental problem is the one Keynes imagined, but it's kind of turned out in a different way. The fundamental issue is the abundance of information and of labour, but alongside mechanisms that artificially constrain the supply of information and that force the work of the majority, I would argue, to become ever more intense, even as it becomes less necessary. Paul Romer, in his famous 1990 paper, Endogenous Technological Growth, said, look, the natural state of an information economy is monopolies. Only a monopoly is going to prevent the price of these information goods from falling towards zero. He wrote this before Microsoft Windows was invented, before Nokia got 40% of market share and then collapsed, before iTunes had 95% of all recorded digital music, and before Android phones, as I say, took 70% of all handsets. It was a great insight. The modern tech economy is very monopolized. There's not four, as there are in accountancy. There's always one. One Facebook, one Google, one Twitter, one Amazon. There can't be two. Now, conventional economic theory thinks these monopolies are an anomaly, that they are naturally eroded by information spilling out to the rest of the world. Patents or eventually escape. Go to Cromford in Derbyshire, the first factory. It looks amazing. How weird is it that there's also a place called Cromford in Germany that looks exactly the same, because one guy got up, took his knapsack over on his back 3 years after it opened and moved to Germany and said to some German capitalist, hey, why don't we set up a copy of Richard Arkwright's factory? That happens. But modern information companies, their entire business model is based on monopolizing these information spillovers. That's what they're there to do, to take the value out of what we provide for free to them by interacting them. Now, I'm coming to my point. A growing number of unusual and heterodox thinkers, economists, lawyers, and technologists, are convinced that these monopolies are doomed, that they'll be replaced with an economy where large amounts of information are produced and exchanged, if not for free, then at negligible real prices. Alongside traditional production for the market and provision by the state, a third kind of activity is growing up: non-managed, peer-produced, non-market activity based around information. Some, like the Harvard law professor Yochai Benkler or the French economist Jan Moulier-Boutang, see this as a new kind of capitalism, a third capitalism they call it, as different to industrial capitalism as industrial capitalism was to the mercantile capitalism of Francis Drake. The internet, writes Boutang, the French professor who studies these things, is both the ocean and the galleon of this new economy. That is, it provides both the way and the means to find the new El Dorado. Others, me included, believe that the change is even more fundamental, that there is great social utility in the information that's being produced, but not enough value in the market sense, and that once the monopoly model is eroded, once Google and Facebook and blue, what are they called, Blackberries. So, once Androids go the way of Blackberries, once Facebook goes the way of Windows 95, it's going to be like the conquest of the Americas for sure, but without the gold. That's the problem. Now, let's think of a concrete example. iTunes. Maybe some of you classical music fans like me and you have an iTunes account. We could all own every iTunes in the world, but we wouldn't need to own it if all of us owned every tune. They're all on one server in Cupertino, California, so that's where they are. So we could share them. Now, all we need is an economically viable way of working out what we should pay. Should it be 99p a track? I think probably not, because did John Lennon and Paul McCartney sit down in 1963 and write Love Me Do so that it would be 99p in 2008? They may have done, but it was 70. Actually, I worked it out. It's 17p a track a single then, and that was high then, as you remember. That was a lot of your income. It was the equivalent of 17p a track because a single was 33p. Okay, so they didn't write it for nothing, but they didn't write it so that Apple could get 29p out of the 99p of every track. I don't think they did write it for that reason. Did they write it to give it away? No. Somewhere in the middle, have you ever bought an album, a vinyl album from a car boot sale for a penny? You can pick them up for 2 pence sometimes. So some tracks can cost less than a penny, but others cost 99p. And we don't really know why, but in the Apple world, all tracks cost 99p. And my contention is that is not market forces. That is the power of a highwayman standing at the crossroads saying, I have my pistol, you want to cross my crossroads, you must give me the 99p. So that's how monopolies work, and I don't think it's viable. Right, moving on. Now, for some reason, my thing is locked up, but I'm going to try and work out what's going on. I will improvise from here on in. You'll love this because it'll become much more relaxed. Okay.
You were extolling the virtues of that machine.
What's that? It might come back. Yeah. It might come back. Okay. I might. So, okay. Where does it go? We have, in other words, a model of a kind of economy that opening up to us because of technology, that where some things probably are naturally free. And what does this mean? It means that not only information products act this way, because it's a really tough economic concept. I don't think any economist or accountant has got their head around this, but there is an information content to real things now in a way that there wasn't. Lancaster Bomber the plan for the wing was drawn on silk, in real 1-for-1, and then that silk was put in a loft. They still exist, these lofts. It's there because silk doesn't shrink. So that's how the blueprints are kept even now. And planes were drawn on silk at the 1-for-1 size. Now they are designed on computer, but that's old hat. They are designed on computer, they are virtually built on a supercomputer, so that every strut, every screw, every aluminium bit, every bit of carbon fibre behaves as it would in reality, and then they're flown. The tail wing of the Tornado fighter was stress tested, says the bloke who did it, he told me, 12 times using slide rules and calculators. 12 case loads were tried on that piece of fuselage. The Typhoon Eurofighter, which replaced it, was stress tested 186 million times on a computer. And while then it was an iterative process, today you can test it, anything 186 million times side by side on a supercomputer. The fastest supercomputer in the world is 33 times faster than it was 20 years ago. Now, what does this mean? It means that real things suddenly have a life, a thing inside them, an information. Obviously, a modern plane can't fly without a computer. Obviously, it's firing back real-time information to Boeing or to EADS, to Airbus in real time. That's that thing that happened with the Malaysian jet. It's firing information in real time. That information is largely invaluable to running an airline. Without the information, you can't really run the airline economically, and you can't fly the plane without the computer. So old things, jet engines, planes, jets, have a new life with information inside them, but we don't really know how to value that information. And the theorists of cognitive capitalism, as it's called, think that what is actually happening is that there isn't a lot of value in it, that the value of it is, once you've made it, on a decline. It's zero. It's going towards zero. Right, now what does this mean? It means first, we're going to be able to automate loads and loads of jobs, service jobs, kind of jobs you do, kind of jobs that your children do. And second, that the bargaining power of labour is not going to recover on its own. The headlines last week were dominated by this image, I don't know if you saw it, in Turkey, of this guy in a suit kicking the miner. So the miner was upset because he thought his relative had died. He protests as the Turkish Prime Minister comes through, and he leaps off the pavement. The security guards grab him and wrestle him to the floor, and while he's on the floor, the special advisor of the Prime Minister in his suit decides to kick him. And somebody said, well, is this symbolic of the Turkish situation? I think it's actually symbolic of the whole global situation. The bargaining power and prestige of labour is minimal. There are levels of repression going on against perfectly ordinary protests in this world that Keynes' generation would have regarded as fascist. Turkey, Russia, the NYPD at times behaving in ways that really do resemble Mussolini and Stalin's security apparatus. Now, but what about the guy in the suit? He has oligarchic power. The modern rich have a real oligarchic power which derives from their position as rentiers, as rentiers in the situation. That mine, the modern way of making money is to corner a resource, get your political friends to give you access to it, prevent any safety inspections because your political friends can stop it in Parliament. Of course, register it in London so you don't pay any tax, and then you cream the profits. That's what's going on in that mine. And if we were to imagine a world, as Keynes, I think, did, in every stage of his life, where there is social justice, where those things don't exist, where there is outrage at the idea of a man in a suit kicking a miner, we're going to have to imagine, as Keynes did, what we would do with abundance and how we would get there. That's the power of the essay to me, but also the challenge, because I think this thing about information and its reduction of the value of things, the market value, could be the missing link in explaining the great surprise outcome of neoliberalism. That is the impoverishment of ordinary people. Because it looked at the time like it may have been the result of class struggle. So the Thatcher takes on the miners, the unions' bargaining power is smashed. You can't argue for a wage rise. Everything's pushed down towards the minimum wage unless you're a very, very high-skilled niche person or an MP, or a journalist in my position. Let's be honest. But it might be that the information thing is part of it, because if there's a surplus of information and that the inputs are getting cheaper and cheaper and labour is less and less needed, and 47%, as the Oxford Martin Institute predicted, of service jobs are automated by the middle of the century, then that's only going to cheapen labour more and more. So here's the challenge. Actually, what you could do, the word post-capitalism is being used now by not just the left, but by economists of the mainstream and the right to try and understand this. What you could do is imagine alongside the private sector, alongside the state sector, another sector that isn't like the third sector as in charities and NGOs, but a sector that is basically the non-economic use of resources for free, as in freedom, to do things. This is beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen certainly in the computer space. It's beginning to happen in crisis-hit countries. There are a whole number of micro-utopias, as they call themselves, taking place in Spain, Italy, Greece, in response to the crisis. People are starting to, it's almost like barter, but it's more complex than barter. I think actually even in Lewis there's been like a local currency, hasn't there? But that's not just a kind of happy experiment. I think it goes along with this other thing. So, in order to kind of rethink the kind of contribution Keynes and his people were making, isn't it interesting that it's not just the kind of program of redistribution and intervention to reshape the economy in a way that distributes more fairly? I think that is there, and that's something that is obviously, I think, very vital. I think it's to start for governments and people and entrepreneurs and ordinary actors in the economy like ourselves to start thinking about what are we doing when we exchange for free things? What is that? And could it be not just a kind of philanthropic gesture, but could it be the beginnings of an economy? Could it be, in other words, Keynes' prediction coming true? That, but in a different way. Not through the power of compound interest, which is busted forever, I would argue, but through the power of a rising abundance of a kind of thing Keynes could have barely conceived. Through the rising abundance of information goods, we are on a path to reshaping the economy. If you are, then what is going around you, and maybe your children and your grandchildren do this, this sheer level of creativity in the modern economy and in modern society, which sometimes looks like time wasting or diversion, actually could be the bit where all the wealth is. Only it's not economic wealth. It's the kind of wealth that over there in that lovely 17th century farmhouse that during World War I they thought they were creating. The amazing thing is that Grant and Strachey and Fry and Keynes all understood this leisure class thing. Actually, they were going to be the elite leisure class, but it would trickle down. That wealth of ideas, beauty and aestheticism would trickle down as society got richer. That's what the essay is about. So I think, for me, the whole abundance thing in Keynes, which looks like a kind of whimsy, doesn't it? I mean, it was seen even then as a whimsy, as a kind of, well, why did he make why do that amid the recession and the depression? It's not a whimsy, but it's a far-sighted insight into what the future of capitalism might turn out as. And we have to imagine it even more ardently, I think, now, and more, because we're nearer to it. And we're also in a crisis again. We have to begin imagining things in the way Keynes did. And if you think the work of imagination is valid and fruitful work for economists, here, of course, is the place to do it. Thank you.
Well, there was a huge amount going on in there and lots of themes.
Yeah.
I think what we do is 10 minutes, we'll chat, and then another 10 to 15 minutes for general discussion. One thing which could be a good lead-in, I think you said, Paul, that the Bloomsbury ideal was to work as little as possible. I don't think I noted it down. Perhaps you didn't say it, but I don't think that's right. They were very hard workers, but what it does mean is that they didn't think of work in the same way as is commonly assumed. I mean, they didn't think of it. They didn't think of their ideal wasn't to spend their life in idleness, but not to work for money instrumentally. In other words, they regarded work as something of activity that was done for its own sake and not just for the sake of money. And that means we've got a problem in our language because we like to contrast work with leisure, and we think of leisure as something that's connected to idleness, whereas in fact Bloomsbury didn't think of that at all. They thought of work as creative, intrinsically valuable. So, what did you really mean when you said that,
What I meant is, okay, look, I do think I was talking with some Liz Fogan, who was before I think, about reading those Bloomsbury pronouncements about the leisure class and being appalled by them, in an earlier stage of our lives when they said, the leisure class should exist to live an aesthetic lifestyle and to set examples and standards for other people who eventually will come to see that beauty and art, etc. Look, so I think they did think that, but of course, as you say, they thought life, so play and work could be fused into one activity. And actually, of course, this the pedigree of that idea is Fourier, the great utopian socialist, who believed that work and play could be fused once there was abundance. That's what the Fourier, the Phalanstères, all these little communities in America that you can still visit the ruins of. They didn't do very well. That's been a utopian socialist idea. Now, I suppose my hostility to it comes a bit from Marxism, because Marx famously said, work can never be play. He actually writes this in the Grundrisse, as Fourier imagines.
Except after the end of capitalism.
But no, because what we will do is we'll free ourselves from it, in the sense that Marx has written a lot about the abundance of information, and it's not me who's discovered it either. He imagined machines that never broke down, imagines machines that reproduced themselves, which is what software is. Breaks down, but it doesn't wear out. So I think it's a nice thing to be doing, isn't it? Disputing the form in which a society in which no one needs to work would look like, what it would look like. But I think the Bloomsbury vision of it is this fusion of work and play. But there is another vision which basically says you eradicate the need for work through just progress and through, I'm being concrete here. I'm not just talking about flights of fancy. Through delinking work from income. There's whole parts of the world, Switzerland, Argentina, which are experimenting with the idea of incomes that are not earned. That's what I mean.
Yeah, but we go on in a minute to, that's an introduction to my second point, really, or question. You projected a future in which people didn't have, in which the cost of things was so low that you didn't actually have to spend any time making them. There'd be almost free goods. If there's a lot of free goods in the world and the number of free goods are increasing, rather like bananas you take off a tree and those images of the Garden of Eden, then what do people do?
Well,
I mean, in your sharing economy, you don't actually, private property, you don't have to work in order to accumulate money in order to get things, because the cost of a lot of things will simply fall to zero. So then, what is the human race going to occupy itself with?
This was exactly what Keynes, as you know, Robert, asked in the essay. He was very worried that we would be suddenly bereft of this thing that drives us, and we'd be psychologically doomed. So we'd be in a terrible state because we wouldn't understand what it's like to wake up and not worry about anything. That's what anything monetary, pecuniary, or fiscal. So what does it look like now? Okay, Google famously gives its engineers the 80-20 principle, that they are allowed to spend 20% of their time on any project they want. That was how Google worked, and their rationale was, of course, but what they do is they capture the intellectual property. So the intellectual property that is produced in the 20%, in the 1 day a week they work for themselves, is owned by Google. It feeds into a wider thing. So we're already seeing non-managed production. Wikipedia is a good example. Non-managed production. Yes, of course, it's sometimes wrong. Yes, of course, there are big wars over editing the pages. But the people who do it voluntarily. So you then have to ask, well, who are they? Maybe there's some people in this room who are Wikipedia editors. There's about 29,000 people in the world who are very serious volunteer Wikipedia editors. My suggestion is they're doing it in their spare time, that spare time is earned from having relatively high-value jobs in which the necessary labour, it's quite a Marxist concept, but it's quite a good one in this respect, is low. Mm-hmm. The necessary work is low, so that in the time they win for themselves, they do that work. But let me throw it back at you. You know that essay. You've written a whole thing about it. What do you think he thought people would do when there was no need to work?
Well, he thought that people would, if they were well educated for leisure, that they would simply expand the fulfilling range of activities that existed and which were cut off by having to spend so much of your time on drudgery, essentially. I mean, he just thought in terms of the expansion of valued activities by people. But you see, against that, I mean, there's a whole line of argument, and you do find it, the whole time. Work is what gives people their identity, and that if they were deprived of their 40-hour week and having to get up every morning and sort of, spend their time that way, they'd go to pieces. They'd get drunk, they'd sort of just, they wouldn't do anything. And that's the fear. It's the fear of leisure, isn't it?
My father's generation were socialised for that to be the case, and therefore in the 80s, when they were thrown onto the dole, that is indeed what, not so much the drunkenness, but many people were depressed, lots of people died early. That was true. But if you look at work now, okay, there's two kinds of work. There's the work in the Amazon Fulfilment Centre, where, if you're really lucky, you get the thing on your arm that tells the bosses where you are every second. There's that kind of work. And then there's the kind of work that not just people like me do, but many people in the Sal area do. And what does it, first of all, do? We've long ago given up trying to separate off work time and leisure time. So that, does anybody's boss, maybe a few bosses now, maybe there are some places where you still get into trouble if you're on Facebook or Wikipedia or booking your holiday while you're at work, at your workstation. Okay, maybe there are some, but in a lot of the Sal area, it's not. Because if you're not doing it on your workstation, you're just going to do it on your mobile, which is by one of your mobiles, one of your devices. So at work, you're doing things that are not strictly, in the Marxist sense, valorising the capital that you are, working with. Meanwhile, you go home, 12 midnight, hello, something's gone wrong. Would you please sort it out? You get an email. You're on holiday, you get an email. You're on holiday, you don't get an email, you're surprised. Our lives, our work life and our non-work life have become very blurred by technology. And therefore I think that we are not going to start panicking. Actually, you do start panicking if you don't get an email on holiday, but we're not going to start panicking once we settle down into it. Well, I think that the relationship between turning up and hitting that clock dial on the 12 button and leaving at a particular time is only really true for people in these very highly intense, highly exploited, I would argue, work situations. And many of us are actually paid to be ourselves. That's what a creative worker is. Somebody working for an ad agency who's really highly valued. They're not being paid to turn up from 9 to 5. They're being paid to be Jessica X, who has these amazing qualities, and please don't leave. That's really what the work bargain is. And please answer your phone at midnight if stuff goes wrong. But whatever you do, don't go to ad agency Y. That's what we don't want you to do. What you do while you're at work is kind of, if it produces value at the end of the day, we're all happy.
Yeah, we must throw this open, but the only thing I'd say about that is I think a lot of that is managerial ad talk. I mean, you know, the idea that people are wonderfully fulfilled in their creative jobs, and that when they make sandwiches for pret-a-manger, they're passionately creative.
No, but absolutely. No, absolutely. I think I agree with you there. That I would put the pret-a-manger right in the Amazon, in the same as Amazon. You know, pret-a-manger CEO has famously said that the turnover of each store correlates to how much people touch each other while they're serving you. Not just how much they smile, but how much they... So basically, touching is a valorized activity now. Yes. I mean, touching you. You see, that my dad's generation, if somebody was told to touch somebody, I think they would have been touched in a kind of quite high... You know, but now, yeah.
Now touching is part of the fulfillment.
And you don't get paid any more for touching. It's just that in the end... Yeah. McDonald's, which owns Pret, gets the profit from better turnover. You get a smile. You get a little extra tick on your badge, I think.
And also, you're not doing, even though they may think you're doing, what they want you to do is to do what they want you to do, but with a smile. Yeah. That's really it. And they try to arrange things so that can happen.
It almost makes you want the Keynesian era sort of transport cafe where they slam the tea so that it bubbles over and then stains the side of the white cracked cup, and then they throw the stale old beans and toast.
Famous British bad
That
service.
becomes like quite nostalgic, doesn't it?
Let's open it up. Who'd like to? I saw a gentleman with the white beard.
Yeah, so the next one.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, obviously, about the future for our grandchildren, whom we're all very much concerned about. One of my concerns, and I don't know whether Keynes ever said anything about this, because I'm not a student of economics, but one of the things that concerns me is that it seems to me that we are now, I mean, in this country we have, 2 million unemployed, that the world is going to actually end up with the advance of technology with an ever-increasing number of people who are unemployed. So whether they can usefully spend their time or just get drunk, as you perhaps suggested, I'm just wondering where their income is going to come from and how they're going to go on eating and living any sort of civilised life, as the unemployed inevitably, I think, will grow.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to...
Well, look, interestingly enough, at the heart of the welfare state concept, there's always been income not related to one's just desserts, hasn't there? And if you look at, I call these communities in modern Europe Reiki community, the Reiki economy, where often they're quite low-income communities, often coastal or rural, where basically people have worked out that with things like family credit, and self-employment, so you're self-employed, you can still get family credit, or there's a form of JSA that's for the self-employed as well. You sign on, you show willing, you do some work, you earn some wage money, but then the person who does Reiki, basically somebody else teaches them yoga, and somebody else does their drains and their gardens, they look after their chickens or walk their dog. After a while, it becomes a kind of economy. Now, my concern is not that it's not a happy economy. Often these are very happy places, parts of Pembrokeshire, parts of, this Western Scotland, the Highlands. The people live like that. But it's only really possible because there is effectively a DIY basic income. The policy demand that people talk about in this regard is called the basic income, detached from welfare and from wages. Those who proposed it often propose it, that you abolish welfare and replace it with a basic income that people have, and then they can work or not work, and what they'll do is they'll create a non-market economy alongside it.
Yeah. I mean, the income of a society reflects its productivity. If it's the case that we are a much richer society than we were, but income isn't divided equally, remotely equally. So that means that you have a very, very small number of very, very rich people, and a very large number of median income people who actually got poorer, if anything, over the last 20 or 30 years. So distribution is important. There's no reason why, if you work 12 hours a week rather than 40, actually, why your income should fall. National income needs to be more equally distributed. Yeah.
I think I live in one of those Reiki economies. It's called St Leonard's on Sea. It's just down the road. And there's a lot of poverty there as well, and not much top end. But I'm interested in going back to what you were saying about, well, your title of your book, it's still kicking off everywhere. And if we take the Turkish gentleman last week, literally kicking. If it really is kicking off, why does it not seem to be affecting that oligarch group that you were talking about? Why hasn't Syriza in Syria, in Greece, really, why didn't they take hold when they had the opportunity? Why are these false dawns that we see, really the Arab Spring, why are they not taking hold? The old regimes are coming back, they come back in Egypt, they come back in Tunisia. It seems to be fake to me.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it's sort of a bit. You didn't talk much about
but
that.
I don't mind. Let me give a
shortly,
brief answer
yeah.
to that. I think because in the book that I've written, I do talk about that. I think this generation of protesters and the highly educated, mass intelligentsia that we have in some countries, 50% of the middle class have been to university. What they've learned, which our century, 20th century, didn't learn, is the horrible nature of hierarchy and power. And they've all read Foucault and Frantz Fanon, or the students have, and understood that power is really bad. And therefore, given the choice between having a revolution that fails because you don't form a kind of Guevarist kind of foci group and take power, they would accept that against taking power and ending up as in Stalin's Russia. That's what's in their minds at the moment. That's what prevents people from taking hierarchical power. So I think that's what they come to a certain point, and because then the negative lesson is Syria, where they do decide to tool up, arm up, and go beyond protest and meet force with force. What you've got is Syria. I'm not saying they were wrong to fight in Syria, but revolutions end up like that these days. There's no Geneva Convention in the war between governments and their people. They just kill everybody. So that's why I think they've retreated. But there is a relevant point here to what I've been talking about. When modern revolutionaries retreat, or radicals retreat into the world of thought or discussion or thinking or non-action, they're not doing what Heinrich Heine and Marx were doing in the 1840s. That is retreating into something which is pure poetry plus bohemianism and debauchery. They're actually, thought can be, as we know, material now because of information. So basically, I think these movements will move into the streets and back off the streets. And when they're off the streets, they're still thinking about the kind of society they want to create. They're not wasting their time. There's more to say, but I don't want to distract from the main point.
Yeah. Someone at the back and then you.
Hello. I'd like to go back to the basic point. It's all very well having a leisure class, but we still need people. What happens to those people? We still need people to milk the cows, however mechanically, collect the rubbish, teach the children, change the children's nappies. Where do they fit into this leisured class?
Can I just have a go at that? Look, a lot of the service industries which still employ human work forces are being automated, and it went in stages, didn't it? Agriculture was automated first, then manufacturing was automated more, and now automation has penetrated deeply into the service economy. And some of those jobs that you just described will also be done by robots. I think you can, I think one can get into science fiction fantasies very, very soon, and I think it'll be take much longer. And technology will not determine what happens on its own. There'll be many other factors. I always give the example, of a broad loom weaving process was actually wide loom weaving process was invented in Queen Elizabeth for the first time, and she refused to give a patent to the inventor because she said, "What will happen to my poor subjects if this machine is introduced?" And so it took another 200 years before it entered into the industrial process. So there are lots of forces which will resist this, and I'm not sure they're wrong to, because you can't just simply throw a large part of the population onto the scrap heap and say, look, everything is so cheap now, your labor is not required to produce it. Because, I mean, the adaptations, Keynes pointed this out, the psychological adaptation to not having to work for a living is huge. And it has to come gradually. And I think it's a matter of social technique and social policy, how one deals with that. But it is coming inexorably, and it shouldn't be regarded, I think, as a threat. It can be a threat, but it should be regarded, as I think Keynes did in his essay, as a liberating thing. It liberates humanity from being the beast of burden, which is the Genesis story. I mean, it sort of overcomes that.
The classic economist's argument against what I'm arguing and what you in your way are arguing too is that capitalism always creates new needs. So in the Edwardian era, suddenly cinema, radio, eventually radio, cars, pub, new types of pub, great. So capitalism has a get out of jail card because it creates new need that is at a higher level, and demand expands, even as the old needs, the cotton, the cloth, whatever, gets produced so cheaply that you can just churn it out. Now, I think this is what is happening with information technology, but there is a problem. That is, that the new needs are being created, and of course we all love having these devices. There'll be 10 billion devices on Earth for 7 billion people by 2018. But what is the content of that is not economic, that the needs created are not economic. If it is true that information wants to be free and that there's this curve towards zero for information goods, then you can create as many of them as you want and as many new needs, but you're not creating new economic demand. And the only place then capitalism can go is in the commercialization of the interpersonal. So as well as sex work, you can get affection work, anti-loneliness work. These things already exist. But in other words, into what we thought were our personal lives comes the market, just as it did into water. Who paid for water till 1980? That soon you could pay for everything. But there again, it's the Reiki economy. It's not a rich economy, because person who's the barista, at the coffee bar, and maybe in their leisure time goes and buys a bit of anti-loneliness service. What can they pay for it? And what can the anti-loneliness service worker pay?
I think you can charge a great deal for anti-loneliness services.
Well, no, but, or social care, as it's sometimes called. But do you know what I mean? That this is what the Marxist economist Andre Gortz was obsessed about, that there are limits to capital if it wants to expand into our everyday lives, because it can only expand into a kind of world of poverty and micropayment, and that the information side is free.
Yeah, have you anyone seen the film Her, where a lonely person falls in love with a computer program called Samantha, and she provides wonderful anti-loneliness services, but of course it is free.
Right.
Yeah, sorry. Two more questions. One over there, I saw another coming over here.
I was struck that you haven't talked particularly about the environmental constraints to growth and the impact that will have in terms of your vision of work in the future. the famous quote from Kenneth Boulding that anyone who thinks that infinite growth on a planet of finite resources is possible is either an economist or a madman. And it seems to me that that's going to accelerate the progress towards this kind of Reiki economy or whatever you want to call it. But I think we still need to recognise that even with your electronic gadgets and so forth, they are still hugely dependent on energy and so forth. And so that idea of capitalism's get-out-of-jail-free card is actually still going to come bumping up against the constraints of growth.
Well, I agree with that. And the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm not just sort of free associating here when I talk about this. I think that the proper work of an economist, or one of the proper tasks, is to work out what the transition process is between now and an economy where all three things, state, market and free, interact. And that's what I'm trying to do. That's the work I'm doing. Now, in that work, in other words, think about the first thing, though, before we go on to the environment. What it means is that the classic socialist transition that Keynes, the leftist Keynes, would share with a Marxist economist like Hilferding, the state drives the market into non-existence through intervention, might not be the transition path. The transition path, possibly to a non-market economy where everything is free, could be the growth from below of these new non-market forms of activity. I think that's the first stunning thing to think about if you've been a leftist from the 20th century. First thing. But the second thing is this where I'm glad you asked me that, in other words, is that even if we can do so many things from below, I've become convinced that the scale of the environmental challenge of global warming is so great that almost the only thing we need to do Stalinist things for is that you can't solve it through the Reiki economy. That you're probably going to have to, if you believe, the worst predictions of what is going to happen, you probably have to go into take control of and ownership of and decommission the entire hydrocarbon industry because it's not worth anything. You know the famous, you know this, Caroline, the shares are valued as if they burn all the carbon in the ground. If they burn all the carbon in the ground, we're sitting underwater. So the shares will be worthless then, but if they don't burn all the carbon on the ground, the shares are also worthless. Ergo, logically, the shares are worthless in all the hydrocarbon companies in the world. Possibly a solution would be just to take control of them. That's quite Stalinist, that's quite statist. And I think it's possibly the only use of Stalinism and statism left.
Last question. Your hand, yes.
Man here.
There has of late been much vocal criticism by the younger generation of the older generation, saying that we, the older generation, have had life easy. They have not. And also it's largely the fault of the older generation. Are we guilty or innocent?
Well, people get the politicians they deserve, don't they? I think our affairs have been quite seriously mismanaged in economic terms since the 1980s. And I think that's true of the United States as well as Britain. And it's somewhat true of Western Europe too. What we've done constantly is to recreate scarcity. Just when we seem to be sort of getting a bit beyond that, there it comes back again. And of course it hits each new generation when it re-emerges. We have many devices for recreating scarcity. I mean, the most effective one is war. Because war just consumes capital, so it diminishes it, then you have to restore it again. We're good at that. We also allow depressions to happen, and we don't need to. There was no need. I think the economic affairs of Britain and the United States were terribly badly managed in the 2000s to allow colossal banking excesses leading to banking failures, and of course a huge build-up under the eyes of the regulators and people who ought to have known better of unsustainable debt and fraud on a massive scale. I mean, these are facts, and they helped to produce a misery for the next generation. It makes me angry when politicians say, well, you know, we've all got to tighten our belts, as though it was people's fault, you know, the fault of most people that these things happen. It was the fault of our rulers. But then, having said that, you know, we're in a democracy. We live in a democracy. People want to change things. If they want to try and get better standard of government, they've got to vote for people who can deliver it. Now, it may be true that those people don't offer themselves for election. I mean, that is a grim possibility.
It is.
But I do think the older generation are to blame. I don't think the young are to blame. I think the young are demonized, have been demonized enormously. I think they're victims, largely, of the faults of their elders.
What we know is pretty certainly that the Keynes wrote about our grandchildren, but actually, you know, I don't have any children, and therefore I won't have any grandchildren, but I'm of the age where I would have, you know, they would, in 2030, they'd be becoming adults, those grandchildren, or they'd be teenagers. So, okay, 2030, this generation that's lived through the financial crisis in the West knows that it's going to have a worse adulthood than its parents did, and that it is the first generation since the 30s to whom that has happened. That's what's shaping their doom-ladenness, their despondency, but also their revolts. It's what shapes their non-committalness to hierarchical solutions and leftism on the old scale. But if you look at what's probably going to have to happen, because I've purposely talked about the blue skies end of what I think a modern Keynesianism would be. I don't think Keynes wrote about abundance by accident. He believed there was a path from capitalism through liberalism and aesthetics to a better life where there was enough for everybody. I think that's worth holding on to. But there's the other bit, which is about just redistribution now. And redistribution now, I'm afraid, is going to hit those who are older if they have asset wealth. Because Piketty points this out, I think he is very right about this, although he's a bit utopian on some of his demands, that asset wealth is the way that bad distribution, you know, that unjust distribution is happening. We've seen it now in the London property market. When I interview young people, some young people are now involved in protests around evictions, okay? And what comes into your mind is evictions from squats, but it isn't. It's evictions from rented flats that they only get for 1 year. 1 year, rented flat, you complain about the state of the drains, you're out. Next person, same thing. Oh, they've finally twigged, after several years, that this is not a great thing. So they started to resist eviction. And the people involved are not nose-ring people, you know, they are quite ordinary, respectable people. Now, who typically are the landlords? Is it some kind of a 1960s Rackman-style landlord? No. It's a person with one buy-to-let flat. And that person has bought that buy-to-let because all their other assets aren't giving them any return. You know, our age group, you know what the return is on money. It's zero. So what do? Financial advisor, buy a buy-to-let flat. And what we're doing is we're actually creating in microcosm in these situations this distributional problem. I'm afraid at some point that asset wealth will have to be shrunk, and the cash and income wealth of the young will have to grow. That's simple, their wages will have to rise, and probably Keynes would have done this. I'm absolutely sure Keynes would have done this, just as Reinhardt and Spranica, the two American economists, recommend. You just use inflation. You just take inflation, let it go for a bit, and it wipes out the value of existing assets, and that's what it does. That's what they did. That's why. What do you get if you do that in 1945 to 1960? The longest boom you've ever had.
That's a big discussion, but Paul, thank you. Thank you very, very much for coming.
Thank you for listening, everybody.